Donald Trump finally caved and buckled like a bitch. He gave the green light to Republican leader in the Senate, his sycophant goon, Mitch McConnell, to finally end the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. I have a lot to say about this. Everyone involved is about to get a piece from me today. The idiot brigade, Trump and Mitch McConnell, of course. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi pissed me off with their terrible negotiating skills. Shocker. I might even have to lay into Bernie Sanders a little bit on this one for a speech he gave on the floor of the Senate today. But first I'd like to say I'm happy government employees who missed multiple paychecks because of this epic display of idiocy and incompetence will finally be getting paid. In the segment I did about the shutdown, I mentioned over 800,000 government workers were furloughed. Many of them just weren't allowed to go to work, and the rest of them had to work for free, some of them for over a month. In all the reports I've read for weeks prior to Trump reopening the government, they all seem to agree that the only workers getting back paid were the ones who were forced to work. And the ones who didn't, they were just going to tell them to kick rocks. The same for the government contractors. Hundreds of thousands of contract workers will never get the pay they lost because of the shutdown. That includes cleaning services, landscapers, construction workers. All those people are shit out of luck because no one has any plans to pay them for their lost income. So that's the big gripe I have over this deal. Something else that's annoying me is in all this discussion of the government reopening, I haven't heard anyone mention what should have been an important part of any deal to reopen any goddamn thing. Where's the plan and the funding to repair the damage caused by the longest government shutdown in U.S. history? I went over some of the impacts in the segment I did. The national parks are a disaster. No one has been picking up trash or cleaning restrooms for over a month. There's literally shit and piss all over the place. There have been vandalism in national parks across the country. Reports of people cutting down trees to make their own roads and forests in the fucking national parks. The damage to the national parks alone could cost over $50 billion to repair. The FDA had to stop a lot of drug testing and food inspection. Is there any plan to make sure that they can catch up and get back on schedule with all the work that they're supposed to be doing? Government workers had to go into serious debt to pay off their bills during the shutdown. Is there any plans to help them pay off the loans that they had to take out or the interest that they owe now? Those are just a few things in a very long list of things that should have been addressed before any vote to reopen the government. I'm shocked that up until this point, I haven't really heard anyone talk about this except for maybe Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! So now Trump, you're such a fucking idiot. I went over this in another video, but he knows because of logistical reasons, it is literally impossible to build a wall on the US-Mexico border. There are hotels, resorts, mountains, rivers, natural habitats, people's private property, people's homes. He's been briefed multiple times by different agencies in his own fucking government that the wall cannot be built. He can't build the wall. I'm 100% sure he knows he can't build the wall. But Trump, in his typical reality show jackass fashion, decided to put on the dumbest, most outlandish, and costly political stunt I've ever seen. Not to mention the whole time he was doing it, it was obvious that he was race baiting and fear-mongering over immigrants to excite his base and get them to support him. My question to Trump is the same as it's been from the beginning of this whole debacle. What the fuck do you really even get out of this? Because, like I just mentioned, he knows the wall can't be built. So even if for a short time you did look like you were actually fighting for the wall for your base, your rabid base, you know you can't do it, and you also know damn well the Democrats won't fund it. You just had a Republican House, Republican Senate, and control the White House for 2 years, and you still didn't pass any funding for the wall. So why do you think as soon as the Democrats are going to come in, they're just going to give you exactly what you want? So at some point, the jig would be up, and he'd have to go back to his base empty-handed. On top of that, he had to know coming into this, it was going to end with him embarrassingly losing a very public standoff with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Another layer of stupidity is that even if the Democrats gave Trump the $5 billion that he asked for the border wall, it would only cover about 10% of how much he says the wall will cost. So even if he gets what he asked for, it wouldn't be anywhere near enough to build him his wall. So even if he did get as much as he asked for, he wouldn't have his wall. This entire situation is so stupid, I can't even attempt to parse out a scenario where Trump could even conceivably turn this into a positive for himself in any way. But politics and optics aside, this whole shutdown speaks volumes of Trump's character. He doesn't give a fuck about the average people. He doesn't give a fuck about workers. He has a history of stiffing his own workers at his businesses. He'll hire someone for a job, he'll have them do it, and then he'll just not pay them. He's been sued multiple times over this, and he's even lost in court. And now he's graduated to stiffing the entire federal workforce and not paying them for a month in his ridiculous government shutdown. He really just does not give a fuck about anyone but himself. So it baffles me that still, at this late date, there are millions of people in the country who still support him, who think he actually cares about making their lives better or anyone in the working class lives better. How many times does he have to show you who he is? Show you who he is. He ran a fake university and scammed many people out of their savings. Poor people, elderly people, he didn't give a fuck. For some of them, he scammed them out of their entire life savings. After he got caught red-handed ripping off thousands of people and was about to lose the court case, and that would have cost him hundreds of millions of dollars, then he decided to settle and pay out $20 million to the victims. He was a fucking slumlord in New York. That's been proven in court too. The guy's a fucking scumbag. If you learn about his past and the effects of the shutdown and you still support him, I don't know what to tell you. And some people are trying to give Donald Trump credit for reopening the government. Bitch, please. It's his fault the government was shut down, so he gets no credit for reopening it 33 days after, or 35 days after the shutdown that he started began. Now to Mitch McConnell. You're a bitch. Mitch McConnell could have ended the shutdown weeks ago. If he would have just brought any of the bills that had been introduced to reopen the government to the floor for a vote, he would have had the votes to pass it and then to send it to Trump's desk to sign. The only reason why he didn't do that is because it's politically convenient for him not to. He's up for re-election in 2020 in his home state of Kentucky, a deeply red state that loves Trump and where Trump has a lot of supporters. So for the next 2 years, Mitch McConnell is going to be Trump's lapdog and try to appease him as much as possible to get Trump supporters to vote for him in Kentucky. He's so fucking pathetic. Instead of running a campaign on your record as the leader of the Senate, or even on your policy positions, you want to ride Trump's coattails like a bitch, like a sycophant. Because Mitch McConnell knows that the voters don't like him. His policies aren't popular. He's a corporatist, he's a sellout, he's a warmonger, all of the above. He's against workers' rights, he's against single payer, so his policy positions aren't popular and damn sure wouldn't get anybody out to vote for him. He doesn't have the same bombast and out-of-pocketness that Trump brings to the table and that Republican voters just apparently love about him. That's why his name is Mitch the Bitch. Now I'm about to tear into the Democratic leadership. A lot of people have been going around and trying to make it seem like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are so great at their job because for once they didn't give Trump and the Republicans exactly what they want. I give them next to no credit for this because that's a position that literally almost anybody in the country would take if they were in your shoes. So you're not gonna get a fucking parade for doing the bare minimum. I guess you can say for once the Democrats showed a little backbone on an issue and they didn't cave immediately. But what did they even get out of it? Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are such bad negotiators. They could have walked away with everything in the fucking kitchen sink. Instead, they just chose to reopen government and didn't make Republicans pay a price for this entire insane debacle. The Republican Party and Donald Trump were almost unanimously being blamed by everyone in the country for the shutdown. Already went through some of the impacts of the shutdown, and it was getting really bad. And they were taking next to all the heat for it. Which brings me to the events of the last few days, where air traffic control were really feeling the effects of the government shutdown with the extremely short staff, people calling out sick, people just quitting, not showing up for work because they weren't getting paid. And this led to a series of delays that started a chain of events this morning. And it led to delays in Tallahassee airports, DC airports, and LaGuardia in New York. And there were also serious conversations and real conversations being had about whether or not at some point in the shutdown where all air traffic in the country would be stopped. This would have brought the country to a screeching halt. Commerce, the economy, travel, everything you would think of would have stopped. At some point, what would have happened was the stock market would have eventually crashed. And in the last few days, Trump saw the writing on the wall and he knew how bad it was about to get in the country, and especially how bad it was going to make him look. So Trump and the Republicans were sweating bullets, which is why Trump came out so frantically today and declared the government reopened, even though he got nothing out of it. So let me tell you what I mean when I say Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi could have walked away with everything and the kitchen sink. Republicans were so desperate to reopen government, I think they would have signed almost anything to do it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a week. But if the Democrats were to hold out for a little bit longer, and shit would get really bad, shit would have hit the fan, at some point the Republicans would have had to cave because they just backed themselves into a corner over this dumbass imaginary wall. Apparently in the House, Nancy Pelosi is getting ready to bring up for a vote a bill to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And the Democrats have enough votes in the House to pass it. And then it will go to the Senate. If they really went into this to negotiate and to do business, Nancy Pelosi would have went into Trump's office and said, look, in the House, we just passed the $15 minimum wage. The bill is on its way to the Senate. If Mitch McConnell doesn't get the votes to pass it in the Senate, and if you don't sign it when it gets to your desk, we're not reopening the government. End of discussion. So just imagine the kind of position the Democrats would be in if that was their original offer and they stuck to it. Then the Republicans would have to go out on TV across the country and explain to people, knowing the statistics that I repeat on this show every time I get the chance. 50% of U.S. households live off of $30,000 a year or less. 75% of Americans can afford a $500 emergency without going into debt. Medical bills are the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States. We have a record-breaking $1.8 trillion student loan debt crisis. People aren't getting paid enough to pay back the large loans that they have to take out to afford higher education in this country. These 800,000 plus federal workers just went over a month without pay. So if Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats went out and that was their position and they didn't budge from it, the American people would be on their side, no doubt about it. If that was a public debate, the Republicans would get massacred in the next election. It would be a bloodbath. I said before that this was a lose-lose situation for Trump. There was no end game which led to him winning anything. It was just a lose from the beginning. But if the Democrats came in strong like I've laid out, they've almost definitely could have won on the $15 minimum wage. They could have done it for any other progressive priority, like single-payer, free college, universal daycare, literally any other progressive priority you could think of. The Democrats could have, if they wanted to, try to force the Republicans to vote on it and sign it into law. But of course, the problem is the Democratic leadership does not want these policies implemented. They're hooked on that corporate cash, that billionaire cash that funds the party, and as a result, they do the favors for their donors, and none of their donors wanted a $15 minimum wage. None of them want single payer, and none of them want free college. These are always the fundamental problems with the Democratic Party. That they always cave and buckle, also that they're ineffectual and weak, as well as corrupt and brainwashed by corporate cash. Now Bernie, honestly, he gave a pretty good speech on the floor of the Senate after it was announced that the government shutdown was over. He talked about all those policies that I mentioned before: $15 minimum wage, single payer, free college. He blasted Republicans in the Trump administration. But of course, as always, he stopped just short of taking the Democratic leadership to task for their shitty negotiating in this deal. Bernie, why can't you just come out and say what we all know is true? This is one of my biggest problems with Bernie Sanders. Even though I'm a big supporter of him, I love his policies, he started a political revolution, he's on the right side of most issues. But I don't know if he's pretending to really be this naive and gullible, and he thinks that if he doesn't say mean things about the Democratic Party and the Democratic leadership, they'll respect him and they'll implement his policies. Bernie, you've been in politics for decades. You know the amount of leverage the Democrats just had. It was literally unprecedented since we've never had a government shutdown this long. You and me both know if they tried, they could have definitely gotten past some of those progressive policies that I've already mentioned. But they didn't even try, and he knows they didn't even try. He watched them not push for any of those policies for over a month. So stop trying to play patty cakes with them. Stop walking on eggshells and tell it how it is. Tell Chuck Schumer he's ineffectual. Just say it. Go on the floor of the Senate and call Chuck Schumer a bitch, because that's exactly what he is. Tell everyone on the floor of the Senate to Chuck Schumer's face that he could have gotten almost any progressive policies passed if he wanted to, but instead he just decided to reopen the government and didn't make the Republicans pay a pound of flesh. But for some reason, he won't get that aggressive. Maybe that's just not in his nature, or again, he really believes if I'm nice to them, they'll do good things for me and they'll implement my policies. But that's not going to fucking happen. And honestly, Bernie needs to learn this lesson before the end of the primary season. Because in order to override the amount of bullshit and fuckery that is going to be thrown at him by the establishment in the Democratic Party in this election cycle, he needs to adopt a scorched earth policy. He needs to call out the corporate Democrats by name who are actively screwing over progressives and blocking progressive priority. He needs to stop acting like he's going to get them to change their mind with a firm talking to. Instead, he needs to expose them and shame them publicly for the frauds and the sellouts that they are. But that was just a side point. Overall, I'm glad the government shutdown is over. This is obviously not the end of the story. This is only a short-term spending bill that's going to expire in 3 weeks. Trump's threatening another shutdown or to declare a national emergency to build a wall. So we'll see what happens next. I'm not a fan of this deal at all. Other than the back pay for the furloughed workers who were forced to go to work, which was a non-starter anyway, this deal is just lackluster, to put it at best. Overall, this entire debacle was just a sad display of how corrupt and broken and just stupefied the United States government has become.